economics is a field that attacks standard economics. But beyond attacking standard economics, it's also about attacking our intuitions. It's about attacking the kind of things we believe about how we function, how other people function, how businesses work, how consumers make decisions, and trying to get some research into this area that is mostly driven by intuitions. To give you a sense of how practical and personal behavioral economics is, I want to tell you my own personal story into this. Many years ago, I was burned in an explosion of a big magnesium flare. I was burned in almost all my body, and I spent about 3 years in hospital. And one of the worst things that happened to every burn patient in hospital is the process of removing bandages. So you all must have removed the Band-Aid at some point, and you all must have wondered the age-old question of how do you take bandages off? Do you take them off quickly, rip it off, short duration, but every second is very, very painful? Or do you take it off slowly? You take many, many seconds, but each second is not as painful. Which one of those is the right way? And I'm sure you all have intuitions about which one is the right way. It turns out the nurses in my burn unit also had intuitions about which one is best, and they thought that the quick approach was better. So every morning they would take me on a stretcher and they would lower me into a bath with iodine water, and after a few minutes of soaking they would start to rip the bandages. The nurses believed in the quick approach. So they would grab hold of a bandage and they would remove it, and they would grab hold of the next one, they would remove it. And because so much of my body was burned, it was a process that took quite a while, maybe an hour. And at this moment of intense tearing and pain, I would often beg and plead with them to try something else. I said, why don't we slow down? Why don't we try something else? Why don't you take a little longer, a little more time, but not as painful? But the nurses told me two things. The first one was that they were correct, that they were right, that their approach was the one that would minimize my pain. And the second thing they said was that the word patient doesn't mean to butt in or intervene or make suggestions. It just means to sit quietly on the side and be passive. And I think in Portuguese it's the same meaning, right? Yeah, so in almost all languages I've seen so far. So the nurses kept on what they were doing. They kept on using their intuitions and their approach. And when I left the hospital 3 years later, I started studying at the university. And one of the interesting lessons I learned was about the experimental method. I learned that sometimes if you have a question, you can replicate this question in a laboratory setting. You can experiment with different versions of it, and you might be able to find an answer that applies not only to the lab, but also to real life. So when I started doing it, I was still curious about this question. And if you think about it, it's actually a very general question. Imagine you have an experience over time, this lecture, a movie, a dinner. How should we space things over time? Think about the movie. You have a few good scenes and a lot of boring scenes. When is it best to have the good scenes? In the beginning or at the end? Do you want to have a slope of improving or deteriorating? What happens if you make a movie longer? Is it necessarily better? Or is it all just as good to keep it shorter? But I was curious about pain, so I went to a hardware store and I got a carpenter vise, one of those things that you use to hold on pieces of wood. And I set it in the lab and I would invite people in and I would ask them to put 2 fingers in this vise and I would crunch their fingers a little bit. And I would crunch their fingers for short duration and long duration and high pain and low pain and when pain that went up and pain that went down and with breaks and without breaks, all kinds of versions of pain.